Uh, all right. Thanks so much, everybody. I'm super happy to have such a nice group this evening. Like Eric said, we're gonna cover a little bit of ground, hopefully. I definitely don't want to just limit the focus though. So if you have other questions about the bog, hopefully we'll cover a few of those things. But I'm really excited to do this talk because it's one that I get to do to some degree, talking about bog diversity and talking about what's here. But the one thing that I don't get to do is really focus on specific groups. And so that's what I would like to do. I would like to sort of keep our heads in the greenery, if we will, for this talk this evening. And so first place we're going to start is just with the place. I don't think many of us have actually been there on this talk. Maybe we have. So we're going to give a little background about the place. We'll a little bit about who we are as an organization, and then break right into it. What is here plant-wise? What do we see? Kind of the bulk of the species that we see, or what are some of the really cool things? And we'll talk about bugs along the way too. So that's sort of going to be my focus. It's not my whole focus. You can pull me away very easy from this, but this is what we'll sort of try to target. And I get to be a little biased as well. I'm pulling the favorite things that I like, and hopefully can get you excited about when you come and visit this place. So let's get started with the place. So what is the Sax-Zim bog? Well, it means a couple different things depending on who you might be talking to and what you might know of this place, right? You may know it just as the Welcome Center. You might know it as a couple of the roads that you like to go if you're here birding. And to me, it means a totally different thing than the initial definition. So when we think about the bog, we should be thinking about the Sax-Zim bog important bird area. If you're not familiar with important bird areas, they are designated by Audubon and by BirdLife International as locations that have interesting things, whether it's rare or declining or endemic bird species, or habitats that might be really sensitive or declining or really important during migration, or maybe they have a whole slew of conservation needs. All of these things get considered, and then you get the definition of an IBA. And that's really about it. There isn't much more protection beyond that, which is all good and well because it at least gives you a place to start, right? If you're working on conservation work. For me and for our organization with the Friends of Sax-Zim Bog, we like to consider more. We consider about double that area because all of that habitat is still really important, whether or not it's in, a box. And so there are some habitat pieces that are really, really cool that are totally missed by the initial IBA designation. And so we like to include those. If we take a look at the map, that orange box, so that sort of rectangle there, that's the IBA. That's the 147,000 acres that we would consider to be the Sax-Zim bog. If you're visiting the bog, if you're here birding, or you've just kind of been up to poke around a little bit, you're usually somewhere in this northwest corner of things. Certainly there are places east over in this area that you might explore and head to when you visit the bog, but most of the time it's over here. And now if we this is the greater Sax-Zim bog ecosystem. So this is that larger landscape. And it really is a big place, which means we've got a lot of cool things happening here. And so again, when we talk about plants, I had to stop somewhere. And so we're going to cover some of the cool things that are here and some of the things that you might be surprised to find that we have here in particular. But the whole reason this place is here is because of this oblong little thing. This is a rough outline of Glacial Lake Upham. And when we deal with, I think especially plants, it's really, really important to understand geologic history of the place. It can help us explain a few things a lot easier, to help us also to understand why we might find certain things in certain places. And so the Welcome Center is that little green dot in the middle. If you've been to the Welcome Center, it is about the geographic center of that glacial lake, generally running from northeast to southwest. The other really great thing about this lake, and we'll talk about it a little bit in a couple of further slides, is that where you find things are always in very, very localized places. So if you just take a look at this map by Mackinac here, you'll notice that almost all of the lakes in the region are over here. There aren't any on this whole central western side. There's a couple down here. And that has to do with when that lake drained, it drained from the northeast to the southwest through the creation of the St. Louis River. The Cloquet rivers both came from Glacial Lake Upham. And so you had some drainage happening northeast to southwest. You end up with a high spot in some places. And so all of these lakes are remnants of this glacial lake. It also means there's sand in certain places. And so we'll talk more about that. But just a base understanding here that we are in this basin, basically, in the bog habitats that we have in the Sax-Zim bog. And so we have a place, and now we have our organization. And so as the Friends of Sax-Zim Bog, we are a nonprofit. All the things that we do is through memberships and donations and the like. And we were started as a preservation organization, as a land preservation organization, due to noted increases in especially black spruce logging in the region. A lot of the species that you find here, or you find here consistently, really need that climax sort of conifer forest, the black spruce, the tamarack, and the big old trees. And so Sparky and Dave and Kim started the organization in 2010. So we're not a very old organization. And that land preservation piece has still continued. It's continued to the tune of about 4,200 acres. We're just a shade over that right now. With sort of the continuation of that land preservation continuing through larger land grants that we've got right now, and a couple of other properties that we might be picking up soon. So we seem to always be growing, which is really great. But do note, 4,200 acres is not 147,000, and it's not 300,000, right? It's just a small piece of that picture. So we, as an organization, are kind of for this place. We understand kind of the importance of these habitats for all the biodiversity, and we do our best to be stewards of it when we're out, when we're showing people things, when we're doing what we do as an organization. That 4,200 acres is basically scattered through 8 properties. 2 of those I would consider to be more wilderness properties, so places that we won't really develop ever. They are big swaths of habitat that we've got, and that's what they'll remain for their life, which is great. We also have the property around the Welcome Center. Right now that is leased through St. Louis County. We've got a super relationship. I mean, they let us build a building and a parking lot, and then in addition to the building. So we've got a great relationship with the county, and we're so lucky to have that site in a really, really biodiverse place too. And so if you want to learn more about the properties, we have maps on our website. Pretty easy to find. Most of our properties are in that 40 to 80 acre stretch. Most of them also are black spruce, tamarack, somewhere in that kind of habitat type. Some of our properties have trails, some of them have boardwalks. The whole hope was if we can give somebody a place to go, we can kind of concentrate our activities and explorations in a place where we don't sort of trample all over the ecosystem, because they are sensitive. Bogs are a very sensitive ecosystem type, and we want to do our best. There are ways to get off trail. All that goes to say there are ways to get off trail when you're here. A lot of what we do is from the road, especially if you're around bird watching. We're doing almost all of that from the road. We're not really going off trail doing much of our bird watching, but you can. All of our trails that we have are marked. All of them have signage. And so it's pretty easy to get around right now. There are also boardwalks, like I mentioned, and we've got 4 boardwalks now, one of which is going to get finished and finish its extension this summer, which is super exciting because it runs through some really interesting bog behind the Welcome Center. It will kind of connect our 2 trail systems together, which is really exciting. But for me as an educator and someone who takes groups out, never underestimate the value of keeping people's feet dry and also making it accessible to people who might not be able to do so in other conditions, or maybe are not as sure-footed as they used to be, or might have other mobility concerns. So I'm super excited to have them. I'm so happy that we have such a good network of folks who want to support this kind of outreach into a system like this, because it is really cool. And we do all of this stuff with not a lot of people. If you take a look, this is most of us, and there are only 3 full-time staff. So myself, kind of middle center there, Sarah, upper left corner, and then Sparky right there in the middle. We are the 3 full-time staff. Everybody else you see is part of our board, and are all volunteer positions. They're really lovely folks to have as part of this place, because we really have a lot of good support for the things that we want to try to do, and definitely some good good direction from these folks. But we also have 4 new staff. Because we've been growing, because the organization has been growing, and we have a new addition to the Welcome Center, like I said, the Lois King Education Center. We now have 4 more staff. These are all seasonal positions. We're open, the Welcome Center is open, that is, from mid-December to mid-March, and then from June to August in the summertime. And so we do get a lot of volunteer help, but a lot of the folks you see there at the Welcome Center, if you've been, are staff. Which is great. Seasonal staff, but they are staff, and we're so lucky to have a super awesome group for the first season in the basically new space, which is great. What I'm doing as the head naturalist is kind of a few things. I'm doing a little bit of this outreach. We're doing a little bit of group education, kind of facilitating where the places we can go to be off trail, but also putting on that naturalist hat and finding things and documenting things. So my role as an educator gets to be pretty easy. I know what's around me, and I know where to find the things that I want to show folks, which is really cool. Right now is the start of my year, more or less. My season starts in December. That's really our busy season. And then I'll have more programming in the summer than I do, just because there's so much more to see in the summer than the winter. The big question, though, we've got this place, we've got this organization, and now we really haven't answered this question of what is a bog, or what is Sax, or what is Zim. And this is very easy. These are easy questions to answer. Sax and Zim are both towns. They're historic towns. They really don't exist in the same fashion as they did historically anymore. And so both of them are still dots on the map. They still show up. But if you arrive expecting to see a town, there really isn't anything there anymore. Both were primarily railroad towns. So we are halfway between Duluth and the Iron Range, or thereabouts, which means you have some busy railroad tracks moving people or iron ore or supplies back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And so before mining became more advanced technologically, you really relied on people. And so you had a lot of these little towns in the area that were up working in the mines, and then transitioning back and forth. So very easy, the first part of the name. The second part of the name, I think, also gets a little easy if you kind of understand what a bog might be. And this is one of my favorite comics from Bird and Moon Comics, because I think the top half of this comic shows you the assumptions that people have about a bog. And even people who grew up in an area like this might not know the habitat that they have, but they definitely know that there might be some yucky stuff, right? Which isn't really the case. Most of the time, if you're in a bog, you're really not even getting terribly wet. Only in some places will you find a lot of water. And so you do have more of this really pleasant, really biodiverse ecosystem that is quite sensitive, that can't take a lot of change. And so we'll talk about some of these cool things about these ecosystems as we go. Ultimately, though, a bog is a wetland, right? And if we fall under this big wetland umbrella, you have things like this. I grew up with wetlands looking like this in southern Minnesota. A lot of prairie pothole lakes, a lot of really shallow cattail marshes. And so the big thing to understand, at least when we're just kind of basically defining what a plant community might be, is with wetlands, where's that open water? In a marsh like this, you have open water that transitions to emergent vegetation, that transitions to more shrubby but wet tolerant species, to trees further out, and the drier you get, the more trees you find. With bogs and with fens, which are both very similar to one another, they both can look like this to some degree, very sparsely treed, pretty wide open in some cases. This is a photo from the Toivola Swamp, which is more a fen than anything. And it's primarily vegetated with sedges and grasses. There is some moss component there too, but the dominant plants in the understory here are going to be sedges and grasses, and maybe some shrubby things too, but very sparsely treed. And I think this is a good image of what people have with bogs generally. I think we think of more tundra, sort of, northern Scandinavia, northern Canada, that sort of stuff. But for us, it sort of looks like this. Which again, if you've not visited the bog, maybe you are expecting something more open. But we really have a lowland conifer forest here, and we can get nitpicky with definitions of things, but bogs certainly can look like this. All of the indicators are there, whether we look at water chemistry or we look at plant communities. But if you notice that understory, very, very different. Very few sedges, lots of mosses, lots of club mosses, and in our cases, a lot of trees. Which is really, really cool and makes it a really kind of fun ecosystem to be in sort of year round, which is exciting to me, certainly. This pause is irrelevant to us because we're going to ask or answer all of our questions at the end. But I will remind you again, if you do want to ask questions, feel free to type them in that chat. We will take them at the end. And I'm going to take this time to have a little sip of water here. And we'll move on to cover this big word, bog diversity. And you caught me, it is not a real word. This is a word that we've made up because it helps us sort of describe what we have going on here. And so if we take that apart, right, we've discovered a little bit of what a bog is. We kind of have an idea, I hope, of what biodiversity is, right? All of the variability and the variety of things that are in a place. And if you smash those together, you end up with bog diversity. And so for our purposes, for my purposes, when I'm talking about things generally, this is what I get to consider. I get to consider this big weird word called bog diversity. And if you know the Sax-Zim bog, you probably know it from birds, and that's okay. But just know we've got way more than just birds. Birds make up a chunk, but there's a lot more going on here. Right now, we're approaching 3,200 species documented in the bog. So this is basically anything that I can put, a Latin name to, or somebody can identify for me, or somebody can find out and about. This number is going to keep growing and keep growing and keep growing. And part of the reason we have such great biodiversity is that we have a lot of habitat diversity. We're going to run through those here in a bit, but we are dealing with sort of a landscape. We're dealing with more than just one kind of square box. We're dealing with a lot of stuff here. And I always like to say, that winter's great. Like it's really lovely to be up at 20, 30, 40 below and be out and nobody else is there. That's awesome. But there's so much going on in the summer and the spring, in the warm seasons, that it's for me getting really exciting now that we're approaching the end of February. But part of the bog is this. This isn't bog. This is upland conifer forest. This is white pine, jack pine, red pine, and sand. That means we have a really huge pile of biodiversity that doesn't exist anywhere else in the bog except in this sandy stuff. This more typical boreal forest, really shallow soils, really still highly specialized plants and critters that live here, but definitely not bog. Have the sort of majority, right, that looks like this, that is Ericaceae, so our heaths, cotton grass, tamarack, and black spruce. A lot of those, water tolerant, low nutrient tolerant, acidity tolerant species that do really, really well for us. And a lot of the habitat is this. So we have big, huge chunks of bog. And we'll talk more about this in a few slides, but that's definitely part of it. But then we have stuff that looks like this, kind of riparian riverine forest, basswoods and cottonwoods, which are a couple of weird things for us, with white spruce and some more upland deciduous species, and especially southern things creeping up the river basins. So we have forest that looks like this. We are in the Laurentian mixed forest province, so we do have pretty truly mixed forest, but we do edge into some boreal forest as well. Water systems, we talked about the lakes a little bit, but we have two pretty major river systems with the St. Louis River, at least the upper part of the St. Louis River, as well as the Whiteface River on the east side of the bog. This is a little channel between Stone Lake and East Stone Lake. And so I didn't forget about aquatic plants. I think sometimes we really focus on terrestrial things, but our aquatic plant diversity is really cool. I grew up with aquatic systems. I grew up along rivers. Fish are sort of how I got into this world of everything and anything. And so we'll definitely give some props to some of our aquatic species because we've got some really nice diversity there. And then we've got agricultural lands, we've got farm fields and hay fields, which means we have prairie things that sneak up into this area. And so there's so much here. I hope that's one thing that I could get across, is that we've got a lot of habitat diversity, which means we really got a lot going for us when we think species diversity. And that's what we're going to touch next. That's what we're going to kind of focus on for the rest of this talk. So if you've got other questions on sort of these organizational pieces, please, let's talk about them. Certainly feel free to throw them in the chat. But just know there are a lot of really cool things because we have all this diversity. And that's where we're going next, is those cool things. So like I said, I'm going to be a little biased in the things that I talk about, mostly because I think when we start getting into the nitty gritty, plants mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. Some people really love one group of plants. That's super cool. Some people totally ignore groups of plants, and that's also cool. But I want to try to cover some of these important plants and some of these really interesting relationships they have with the bugs, whether they're pollinators, whether they're just serving as a host to certain things. We'll definitely cover a few pollinators, especially unexpected pollinators, once we get towards the end. But it's going to be a lot of pictures, so I'm going to try to scoot through things here and not get too bogged down with what I'm talking about. But if we just look at the numbers, here's where we stand right now as of February 2023. Terrestrial vascular plants are running about 389 species. So this is including non-trees, non-grasses, the things that are growing above the ground, maybe adjacent to water, but not in the water. If we drop down another level, we can see our graminoid diversity is pretty high, 152 species. If graminoid is a new term for you, think grass-like things that look like grass, whether they're sedges or rushes or grasses. That's a big catch-all for that group. Trees and shrubs, not doing too bad, 105 species. It doesn't feel like that always, but 105 is what we're dealing with here with trees and shrubs. Bryophytes, mosses, I'm going to throw them in the plant group because of course they are. 78 species. We just got finished a couple of years ago with a sort of preliminary survey of bryophytes in the bog. And so we really bumped up our initial biodiversity quite significantly. So 78 species there. Aquatic vascular plants, dealing with 51 species. Which is pretty good. These are, a lot of this data is based on DNR survey work. Most of the lakes in the area have had some pretty good work done to them. And so we've got a pretty good understanding here. I'm sure there's definitely species that are hiding in this aquatic realm, but pretty nice diversity. And then if we run into ferns and archaeophytes, we're dealing with 39 species. So a pretty good spread. If we try to quantify pollinators in the same way, we really can't, right? Because there are a lot of things that pollinate. Not all of them are bugs, and not all of our pollinators pollinate to the same degree as others, right? So some are good, some are not so great pollinators, but they do it, right? But most of our biodiversity so far falls within insects of some kind. And so if we're dealing with 3,100 species or more, thinking, close to 1,500 species or more are insects. And we're certainly going to have more. We haven't touched the insect diversity even close, I don't think, in the bog. And because there's lots of things to consider, I'm not going to put them into numbers. If you have questions about them, I'm going to definitely do my best to help answer those questions. But just know we've got lots of species to consider here. So I'm just going to profile a few of those things as we get going here. And we're going to start with bog specialists. Because if we're in a place that has a lot of bog, boy, we better talk about some of those plants. And I showed you this image before, and this gives you a really good idea of what I'm talking about with bog specialists. We can go for acres and acres and acres and acres of just things that look like this. We might top out at 3 or 4 or 5 shrubby things. Maybe just 2 tree species, so tamarack and black spruce are going to be dominant across this landscape. Maybe we'll find a balsam fir here. Maybe we'll run into, you know, a paper birch, or we might run into a few other things. But for the most part, once you hit about 10 or 15 species in a bog like this, that's really all you're going to find until you really do some digging. And once you get a little closer, you start to see other things. If you add more trees, you start to see different plants. If you add less trees, you see different plants. And so I kind of want us to consider all of these things in this area growing because they have what they want, right? They have either the dappled sunlight that they need. This is bog Solomon seal or three-leaved false Solomon seal. It likes this really nice dappled sunlight that you find in bogs, as does pink lady slipper. But this is not where you find sundews, really. It's not where you find pitcher plants, really. And so, again, what a bog is sort of the same thing, but it can vary quite widely, even across our properties. So we'll keep that in mind when we think about our specialists. But there's a cohort of 4 plants that really are the main kind of biomass of the biodiversity outside of our mosses. And one of them is this plant. It's maybe my favorite. This is bog rosemary. It is a specialist, which means it's going to bloom pretty early. Almost all of our kind of specialized bog species bloom relatively early in the season. So thinking mid-May, maybe just squeaking into June, maybe some years well into June. But I love them. It's a really diverse group of plants. Ericaceae is a really interesting family of plants if you dig into plant taxonomy at all. There's lots of different forms, lots of different shapes. Some of them have flowers that look like this, these kind of lovely upside down little bell shapes. And a lot of these plants have a ton of insect hosts. They are hosts for a number of different species across the board. Primarily Lepidoptera, but there's certainly more that we can talk about, and we'll see here in a second. So one of the many, but maybe my favorite, they get this lovely blue. The leaves turn kind of a blue-green in the middle of the season, which is just awesome. Another one of these specialists is bog laurel. Bog laurel is one of those plants too that is kind of interesting for an early season species, at least in our area. We see a lot of white, right? A lot of white on the landscape in the early season, maybe some blues, maybe purple, but kind of that whitish and yellowish flower color. We don't get pinks really until kind of the middle of the season, but bog laurel we get right away, and we get these lovely, lovely pink blooms across the roadsides, basically throughout the whole place. A super cool species, one that's great to see close up. Pictures really don't do it a lot of good, and so bog laurel, one of those species. But the last two here, Labrador tea, this is Labrador tea, and I'll come back to it, and leatherleaf. Both of these species are maybe the most important when we think about relationships to other things. Both of them are really good and pretty heavy bloomers early on. So when queen bumblebees are waking up, these are some really lovely plants to find. A lot of nectar available, a great source of food for a lot of these species that do fly very early in the season, a lot of these bugs. But they also are a really critical host for a lot of different butterflies. Maybe 5 or 6 that only use these 2 species. Most of those are pretty rare species too, a butterfly that use them. And then if we just add the moths on top of that, there's maybe double that diversity or triple that diversity of moths that just use these 2 plants. And so without this bog, you don't have them. Without this habitat type, you don't have these species. All these 4 that we've just talked about. If you don't have a bog, you don't have acidic conditions, you don't have them. Leatherleaf is a great example of that. This is a species you really don't find in fens. You might, but it's probably a very, very poor fen that's sort of approaching a bog in its definitions. And they really do disappear when you change water chemistry a little bit. And so it's one of my favorites. It's a lovely, lovely indicator of the season. They're usually one of the first bloomers outside of like our maples and our hazels. And things like skunk cabbage. After those are done, then you usually see leatherleaf. So A lovely, lovely species. I could ooh and ah at them all day long. If you notice, all these plants also still have their leaves. I mentioned very early in the season, these things are blooming. They keep all their leaves year round. They'll definitely drop and change and grow new leaves later in the season, but they are really well adapted to extremes. Extreme cold, extreme hot, drought conditions, wet conditions. There's some really amazing adaptations within this group that allows them to survive in this place, which is just but of course, if they're blooming early, I mentioned bumblebees. This is a frigid bumblebee, Bombus frigidus. That we in the Sax-Zim bog, I want to say that we have a claim to fame. I don't think we do, but I want to say that we do. Being a very good place to see this bumblebee. This is a very far northern bumblebee, so we're pushing kind of how far south they get. But we've got a lot of them. And they really, really love these specialist species. I've seen them on bog laurel, on Labrador tea. I've seen them on leatherleaf. I've seen them on bog rosemary. I've seen them go into pink lady slippers. So they really do a lot of pollinating on a lot of these bog species. It's an amazing bee. It's one of my favorite early season things to go out and find. A really cool bee that uses these plants as a food source. Another species that kind of gets us thinking about pollinators and things that are good pollinators and species that are not so good pollinators. This is a really wonderful butterfly. This is a butterfly called Jutta arctic. It is a species that has a really weird life history. They fly every other year, so they fly in odd years for us, where they have a 2-year life cycle. But in some cases, they fly every year. They usually are opposite another species of Arctic called Macoon's arctic. And they like trees as their host. So we think about monarchs using milkweeds and things, but this species uses tamarack and it uses black spruce as a host, which is a pretty cool thing when you think about a butterfly using a tree, but maybe that's not so unfamiliar the deeper we get into pollinators. But really, those hosts are really important. I haven't really seen them nectar on much. They're very hard to find, even though they're quite a big butterfly, but a lovely specialist for us. As is this little thing. This is a lovely species, and I love showing this to people when I'm out. This is a moth. This is a moth called black-banded orange, and it is a day-flying moth, and it also is a bog specialist. It's very, very common if you have the right things, right? If you have Labrador tea, if you have leatherleaf and bog rosemary and bog laurel, you probably have this moth. It uses them as a host. It flies during the day. It nectars. A really amazing little species that, again, without those plants, really wouldn't be around, which is super cool. But of course, it wouldn't be right to talk about bogs without talking about carnivorous plants. We're going to talk about them again later as well. But I can't wait for these guys. The new boardwalk that we've built just behind the Welcome Center should go through some pitcher plants. This is the flower of a pitcher plant. If you've never seen one, they're real weird. They're really cool as far as plant flowers go. I just love them. Here's our pitcher. This plant is so well adapted to this ecosystem, but it has to be open. It can't be these closed forests. So we have a lot of bog, but we don't have a lot of pitcher plants in our area. They like open bog. And so whenever you get openings, whenever you get these sort of shorter, stunted, more open bogs, you tend to have pitcher plants. So I mentioned the dominant 4 plants. They can survive in the shaded stuff. They like the open roadsides, but this really needs a lot of sun. As does this little buddy, roundleaf sundew. We actually have 2 sundew species in the bog. This is roundleaf sundew, and we also have spoonleaf sundew or intermediate sundew. Another set of carnivorous plants that Minnesota has some really good diversity with. I think there's 4, maybe 5 species of sundew in Minnesota. If you've ever been out to Big Bog, Big Bog's got all of them, I think. We've only got these 2. I don't think we have any more. I think this is it. But they're lovely. They're lovely species, and they are plants. All these weird things that they do to capture insects all revolve around modified leaves. So the little spoons on the sundews, those are leaves. Those are just heavily modified leaves. They're taking their sources of nitrogen and some of the other nutrients they're missing from the soil, or maybe lack thereof, by taking it out of insects. which is a really super cool adaptation. One that you see not just in bogs, but you see sometimes in deserts, and you see at high elevations. A really cool adaptation. But where there's adaptations, there's also specialization, right? These can grow in pretty acidic conditions. They can grow in pretty nutrient poor conditions. And they have their own set of insect hosts, or insects that use them as hosts. I wanted to show you this one just to build an appreciation for mosquitoes. This is the larvae of a pitcher plant mosquito. Pitcher plant mosquitoes use pitcher plants as their source of water for their life cycle. So I dumped out a pitcher, and there were 2 of these larvae in it. Super cool. They're taking advantage of this water source. Like I said, not always do you find open water pockets in bogs. Some of them don't have much water at all in them, at least that you can see. And so even though we have a lot of mosquitoes, they're taking advantage of the pools that might be around for, you know, a week or 2 weeks after the snow melts, and then they might be gone. But this mosquito has adapted to live in and not be harmed by the digestion that happens within a pitcher plant. Super, super cool. I was so lucky to find them. I've been looking for them for a couple of years, and finally found the right pitcher plants. But pitcher plant mosquito is really cool, as is this moth. This is a moth that's called sundew dart. You might know it as sundew cutworm. You might know it as Hemipachnobia monochromiata. But it is a specialist that uses sundews as its host. So this adult seeks out sundews, lays its eggs on sundews, and those caterpillars eat sundews. They don't get stuck to them. They have an adaptation where they don't get stuck, and they can survive and continue their life cycle by using sundew. Pitcher plant has at least 5 species of moth that use it as its host. Sundews have at least 2, probably more. So there's these really fun relationships within these specializations, where oftentimes if you meet a specialist, it probably has its own set of specialists, which is the fun thing about the plant world, especially if you look a little bit closer at it. Okay. If you got more specialist questions, please type them into the chat here. But orchids are another really big draw. Oftentimes when we hear about bogs, and if you like plants, you probably think about the carnivores first. So you think about pitchers and sundews, but then you'll probably think about orchids next. And that's a pretty fair assumption. We've got amazing orchid diversity in Minnesota. It might not seem like it, but we absolutely do. And in the Sax-Zim bog, we're really lucky to have 20 species of orchid, with I think at least 2 or 3 different subspecies of species we have, as well as a hybrid that we found, which doesn't occur very frequently. And so I'm just going to work through a few of my favorites here. Know that if you come visit the bog, I can guarantee you at least this orchid. Pink lady slippers are all over the place. We've got a lot of them. They're very, very, very common. You can find them along Grey Jay Way. You can find them at every single one of the properties we have. They're all over the place, which hopefully shows you the quality of habitat we have here. A lot of the times orchids don't show up in places that aren't very high quality, and there's exceptions to that rule, but they have such elaborate relationships with mycorrhizae fungi, maybe with specific pollinators if they do have ways to attract pollinators. I just love them. It's so good to see them. I do an orchid field trip at the end of June every year. We'll usually do about 8 species of orchid. And from the one boardwalk at Warren Nelson Bog, during one of those trips, we had 212 blooms that we could see just from the boardwalk from Pink Lady Slipper. So when I say it's common, it is very common. It is found all over the place. But where we have common things, you bet we've got rare things. I'm so sad that I haven't been able to find another location for this species. This is northern slender lady's tresses. It is a species that we only have known from one location in the bog, and that location got clear cut 4 years ago, and I don't know if that will come back in that area. I haven't been back to check because I love that location. We had 6 or 7 orchids within 150 yards of one another at this spot, and now it's all gone. So I hope it comes back, but maybe it's a little more tolerant than I think it is. But it is a very slender, very delicate species, maybe 6 inches tall. Those flowers are much smaller than the nail on your pinky. So a tiny little thing, an absolutely beautiful orchid. If we think about rarities that you can still see, this is one of them. This is small yellow lady slipper. We have large and small yellow. The small yellows that we've been able to find are only in one location. There are 2 clumps of them, and that's it that we've been able to find so far. This is much more common out west, in western Minnesota, in the bogs in Roseau and Itasca County. Much more common the further west you get in the state. But a lovely little orchid. I'm very pleased that we've been able to see it, and they've been doing well, which is also really, really good. Another very uncommon orchid at this location too is striped coral root. We only have 1 location, and we have 4 plants that we found. So just goes to show you that there is some very, very common things, and there are some very, very rare things right next to one another. But generally, we have good orchids kind of throughout the season. The middle of the season, you get a lot of the fringed orchids. Purple fringed orchid is one that does vary from year to year, but usually we have quite a few of them. Along the roadsides, the wet meadows, that sort of stuff. Lots and lots of great purple fringed orchids, but I love them. They're such a cool orchid to find and to show people because they are so cool. But if we think about bloom period with orchids, we start with this one. This is either northern coral root or early coral root or yellow coral root, whatever you want to call it. It is our earliest orchid, usually. They usually bloom a little bit earlier than pink lady slippers do, and they can bloom as early as the middle of May, usually more reliably towards the end of May. We've got a number of them right behind the Welcome Center. If you take the little trail outside the door of the Welcome Center, you'll probably find this thing, but really, really small, really no more than 3, 4, 5 inches tall. And again, really delicate, tiny little flowers on this thing, but fairly early, which transitions to this one, which blooms very, very late. This is sort of a new orchid. If you have older orchid books, you might not find this one. But this is Sphinx Ladies Tresses. It was part of the Nodding Ladies Tresses complex, and there's been some work done in the last few years on this group, the genus Spiranthes. Lots of differentiation in this group, and this particular species is the one that we have, Sphinx Ladies Tresses. This will bloom into September. I don't know if it'll touch October, but you can expect orchids even that late in the season, which is just awesome. I usually make a special detour for this orchid, even if I'm doing a different program, because it is such a special one for the time of year in September. I just wanted to end with one last orchid, and again show you that we have a lot of good diversity in Minnesota. Much of the sort of the orchids you see in horticulture are epiphytic, so they're growing on trees, in trees, way up high. We have epiphytic orchids in Minnesota too, to some degree. This is one of them. This is heart-leaved twayblade. It grows within the sphagnum hummocks. So if you're walking through the bog, you see these little mounds of mosses. These orchids grow right on top of those little hummocks, which is so cool. Tiny little flowers, unbelievably small, much, much, much smaller, maybe a quarter of your pinky nail for that flower. But this is a really amazing orchid that gets pollinated by mosquitoes, if it gets pollinated by anything at all. It's such a neat plant. The twayblades are really, really cool if you like orchids. So a small one, but a really amazing one to see if you can find them. And we have them in a few places and pretty good numbers of them too. All right. I like orchids a lot. I like these specialists a lot, but the fun is to know what's weird where I am, right? I like some things that are in the southern part of the state, some things that are around the Twin Cities, but for me, I get really excited about the weirdos, the things that just sort of get to us, and that's about it, because they're often the most exciting to find. I like a lot of different plants, but like I said, we've got stuff like this that's definitely not bog, that has its whole suite of plants, whether it's white pine and jack pine, whether it's trailing arbutus or sweet fern, hepatica. We've got round-lobed hepatica in these really weird sandy eskers. The only place you can find them for us is in these eskers. You really don't see them in other places, and so it's really exciting to find stuff like this. Or those riverine forests, right? All these southern things that are just creeping up into our area that we might not have if we didn't have the St. Louis River, or we didn't have the Whiteface River being such prominent features of the landscape. We could say that with birds too, right? A lot of these southern bird species that I get really excited about might be, close to backyard birds for you guys. And so I want to just hit a couple of those things before we move on. One of those are some prairie species like this. This is blue-eyed grass. This is montane blue-eyed grass. Very, very common in the bog, especially along the roads. Roads are one of those things that we don't often think about as being unique ecotypes. But I think they are. At least if you have a wetland, right? If you can dry out, you're going to have totally different things on the top of a ditch bank that you see than you see in the bottom of the ditch bank. And we do have a lot of prairie species that you might find, things like blue-eyed grass or Indian paintbrush. A number of these species that I'm much more familiar with in the southern part of the state or the western part of the state than I am in the northeast. So a really cool little weirdo. Of course, it's not a grass, it's an iris. Doesn't really look like an iris, but it is. Blue-eyed grass is a wonderful species. And again, tons and tons and tons of it in the roadsides. This is a fun one. Last early kind of summer, I went through and tried to find all the violets that I could because I realized I didn't have any violet pictures. This is sand violet. And again, being in a wetland complex, you might not think we have a thing like sand violet, but we do, but only in those sandy spots where that glacial deposition exists. So again, pretty restricted for our area, maybe more common the further north or in the Unoka Sand Plain, maybe much more common. But for us, we've basically got it only in one part of the bog on the north side, which is really cool. I really love finding pine saps. So if you're more familiar with ghost pipes, it's in the same genus, Monotropa, but this is such a weird one. It has so many little flower heads. It grows in basically red pine and white pine, and in sand. And again, if we don't have that, we don't have these little weird things like this. I love it. We've been able to find a couple locations for it, which is really, really good, but a really weird little plant that I just love. If we think about rare things, though, we do have a few rare species that we've documented. This is Xyris montana. This is montane yellow-eyed grass. Yellow-eyed grass, not a grass, sort of like blue-eyed grass, but it is not an iris. It's in its own group of plants. This is a special concern species in the state of Minnesota. And it's really kind of weird because it really only exists, at least for us, in power line cuts. We have thousands of them, but they're only in power line cuts. You don't see them really outside of it in a lot of places. And so, yeah, it's an interesting one that definitely needs some work. If you want to learn more about these rare things, on Minnesota DNR's website, you can sort of see the reason that they list certain species. And so I'd be curious to know with this one. But it's a wetland species, and of course, wetlands are at risk, sort of like prairies. And so a lot of our wetland species do need a little more help. So yellow-eyed grass. I did throw a sedge in there. I don't have a lot of pictures of sedges and grasses, but I did take a picture of this one because it is really cool. This is Carex exilis, or meager sedge. It is also a listed species in the state of Minnesota. I think this is also special concern. It's a wetland species. We only know this one from one location. There's probably more of it in the bog, but right now we only know it from one location. It's not very showy. It looks pretty rough most of the time, but it's very distinct as far as sedges go. So Carex exilis, meager sedge, lovely species, but again, state listed. This one, I'm always surprised that this one has such a high listing. Maybe not surprised. This is cuckoo flower, Cardamine pratensis. It is a brassica. It's a mustard, but it has huge flowers, huge white flowers. It's a wetland specialist, so it doesn't, grow like a lot of our other mustards do, just side of the road or in a weedy old field. The only place we've found it in the Sax-Zim bog is in a little groundwater seep next to the Whiteface River. It's definitely undersurveyed from the folks that I've talked to about it in Minnesota Biological Survey or people who work as botanists for the DNR. They rarely ever see it in flower, and they barely ever find it, even though they know it should be in certain places. It's just really hard to see. It is listed as threatened, though, in Minnesota. It is a globally occurring species. There are non-native subspecies that are found in the US, which can be a problem, right? If you're dealing with a native and a non-native thing, especially being as related as they are, it can be trouble in some cases. So species that is listed as threatened in Minnesota, but may or may not be as threatened as we think it is right now. And the last threatened species I'll talk about is this one. I had mentioned we're going to talk about more carnivorous plants. And here's one of them, Utricularia, the bladderworts. They take advantage of the available kind of macro and micro invertebrates and zooplankton that might be found in waterways that are really, maybe nutrient poor or stagnant and not flowing. Some of them are bordering on terrestrial, like they can survive being a little bit dry, but most of the time you find them in the water. And this is one that you don't always find flowers for. This is hidden fruited bladderwort. And it has cleistogamous flowers, which are flowers that are self-pollinating, that they stay closed. They really don't open. Excuse me. And so to find them flowering is actually pretty uncommon. You don't really see them flowering quite a bit or a lot at all. A lovely species. I've never seen it in flower, but we got lucky a couple of bioblitzes ago, and folks were able to find it. Which was super cool. But again, only known from one location. It is listed as threatened in Minnesota, and probably one of those sneaky wetland species that is maybe a little more common than we think it is, but is so difficult to track down and to find. There are a lot of yellow bladderworts in Minnesota, and so sorting them all out can be a little tricky. But okay, so I mentioned I would talk about the things that I find are interesting or cool in our area, but I did also want to talk a little bit about pollinators. I've done webinars before, or last winter, or maybe 2 winters ago now, about pollinators. So if you like webinars and you want to listen to me talk about pollinators for a little bit, if you head over to our website, we have more talks up, and we'll get more of that at the end. But I just wanted to mention a couple of things when you think about pollinators. And one of the things we should also think about are their host plants, right? Just because we plant something that flowers and is a good nectar source doesn't mean that it's the host plant for the thing we want to attract, right? We can plant all the milkweeds we want, but we should also make sure that there's other food sources available. And a really good example of that is this butterfly. This butterfly called Dorcas copper. Dorcas copper is sort of range restricted in the US, kind of a northeastern distribution, and its host is marsh cinquefoil. But even if you have marsh cinquefoil, you may or may not have this species because it needs other things, right? If you only have marsh cinquefoil, that doesn't give it nectaring opportunities as it's an adult. It doesn't give it, gives it a lot of larval locations, but maybe not for nectaring. And so when we're thinking about planting for natives or planting for pollinators, also consider those host species because they are really, really critical. They're really, really important when we think about really hyper-specific species, like a lot of our butterflies or our moths. So just one thing to consider. The other thing to consider is don't undervalue mosquitoes in their role as pollinators. This is a male mosquito. If you can see close enough, depending on the size of your screen, there are pollen grains all over its proboscis. This one's pollinating, I think, a Juneberry, but one of our very early Juneberry choke cherries. Male mosquitoes do not feed on blood. Female mosquitoes do, but not all of them do all of the time. And so also consider the role of mosquitoes as pollinators. We are very quick in Minnesota to joke about mosquitoes and to call them our state bird and all of this, but they really are important in the ecosystem in a bunch of different ways, not just as a pest or a food for maybe bats or odonates or things like that. So think about mosquitoes and the role they play. But beetles are a huge one. This is a golden velvet beetle. It's one of our longhorn beetles. It is covered in little hairs, and all of those hairs pick up pollen. A lot of our beetles eat pollen, but in the process of finding pollen to eat, they're going to drag it all over plants. They are really sturdy creatures, and so they can fly quite a long ways, maybe more so than some of our butterflies can. And so they are a really critical pollinator, and they're awesome. I love longhorn beetles. This is a really common one for us, red and blue checkered beetle. This thing is loaded in pollen, just absolutely covered in pollen. Most of the time I find them on yarrow. So if you have a lot of yarrow around, look for them because they're very, very common. But beautiful, lovely beetle, one of my favorites. And the last group to keep an eye out for are these guys, the bumblebee mimic scarabs. So they're mimicking bees, but they're incredibly hairy and they're behaving just like bees. They're walking around flowers. I'm thinking this one's another pollen eater. Maybe they're eating the flower petals or maybe eating some leaves too, but they're dragging around all kinds of pollen. A huge big beetle, at least as far as beetles go, maybe the thumbnail width. But they're super awesome. They're a really fun one to look for when you're out poking around. Pretty widely distributed. We've got 2 species in the bog. which is really cool. But of course, bees, right? We should think of bees. We should always consider bees, especially bumblebees. But just know there's a ton of small, tiny little bees that are doing a lot of work out there too. And so thinking about diversity, especially when you think about queens, queen bumblebees are out really, really early. So if you're thinking about the plants or you're thinking about visiting a place and you want to see bees, early season's really good. Bumblebee queens might start emerging as early as March, late March for us. For us up here, probably April, but they need early pollen sources, early nectar sources, just as well as they need late ones. They're overwintering as adults. And so if they don't have a lot of those food stores at the end of the season, we want to make sure we can cover their range. So think about them. This is golden amber bumblebee. This is maybe my favorite bumblebee. I absolutely love them on a thistle. I love thistles. But don't forget about the value of trees and shrubs in their role for pollinators, or as a host for lepidopterans especially. This is perplexing bumblebee nectaring on a willow. Willows give a lot of nectar, but only for a very short time. This was from late April. So this was, I think, 28th of April. And there were a number of queen bumblebees visiting the willows, a number of them. Perplexing bumblebee, tricolored bumblebee, golden amber bumblebee, a few different species. And again, we don't often like to think of shrubs as a way to attract pollinators or to keep pollinators, but trees are such a good host for a number of different things. Oaks are really good. Willows are really good. Lots of really good things, but yeah, they're friends though, the wasps. Don't discount wasps. They do a lot of great pest control around gardens, but they do serve some role in pollination. This is a bald-faced hornet, and you can see this thing is coated in goldenrod pollen. They're moving around. They're trying to find things to eat if they're not nectaring or eating pollen themselves, which means they're going to drag around those pollen grains all over their fuzzy little bodies. So don't forget about the role of wasps as pollinators. A really wonderful group to see, especially late in the season. Goldenrods get covered in all kinds of wasps if you got goldenrods around. And I know I'm edging out of my time here, so we're gonna kind of buzz through these last couple. But moths, so important. We think about butterflies and their role as nectaring and as pollinating in some cases. Moths are doing a lot of it too, and we're just not seeing it. It's happening at night. This is olive arches. They have fuzzy little bodies just like bumblebees, just like the beetles do. They're certainly dragging pollen around. But our sphinxes have really elaborate relationships with a lot of plants. Our clearwing moths, so our hummingbird moths, if we want to give them that moniker, oftentimes have really specialized relationships with plants. They might not be great pollinators because they're taking advantage of nectar from such a long distance, but they often have really elaborate relationships with species, whether it's species of orchids, night blooming cactuses. There's a lot of different relationships globally with sphinxes and plants, and that happens all at night. We're never going to see that really with some of our species. With our clearwings and white-lined sphinx, we can see that happen during the day too, but there's so much going on at night that we don't see. It's also really important to consider when we think about pollinators. So I've got one last piece. I've just got a little bit of time left, so we're going to cruise on through the when question. So if you are excited about this plant diversity and you're excited about these pollinators and all these things that you might want to see, when should you come to see them? Well, right now we're on one side of that screen. We're covered in snow. Certainly you can see some of this stuff when there's snow on the ground, but you really want to come in the summer months and know that there's a range of bloom periods just like you see in your backyard. You're going to see it up here just as well. Know that the fall can still be really good. If you like color change, come on through. Tamaracks are changing color in November. All of our maples and aspens are changing color in September. So you can have a long period of fall color if you would like it. But know that it depends. If you asked me, when should I come visit? When should I come and see the things that I want to see? Well, it really depends on what you want to see. We've got a lot of diversity, and that means one time of the year might be great. Another time of the year might not be great to see that one thing. I always like to ask the question, do you like bugs? Both as a, please, I hope you like bugs and think they're cool, but also I know people don't always like being buzzed by mosquitoes and horseflies and black flies. We have a lot of bugs. That's why the birds come back in the spring. And so that's a question to consider. And then how many days, right? If you live close by and you have the ability to get to the bog every, couple of weeks, that improves your chances to see a lot of the bloom period and to see a lot of how the season does change up here. If you've got a weekend, that changes things, certainly. The last thing I'll mention is that the Welcome Center is only open for a short amount of time. And so if you want to talk to somebody and say, hey, I want to look for this, where should I go? Know that you can only do that at certain times of the year unless I have programs that are outside of the open windows. So I have a last few plants to consider. I talked about skunk cabbage. Our bloom period starts really early, starting in March sometimes with skunk cabbage, with hazels, with some of our maples. If you really want to see something cool, come early in the season, because our conifer flowers and our new cones are just beautiful. This is a black spruce. These are the new cones on black spruce. They're this lovely pink, and it only happens for a short amount of time, and it only happens in the early season. So something to consider there, because a lot of the times this is what we see when we visit a new place. We can't predict what might be flowering. This is skunk cabbage in the front center there. A lot of our bogs get really, really cool the later you get season as well. I talked a little bit about orchids. We do have showies. We do have a lot of them in some places, which is also really nice. But then the fall, I mentioned spiranthes, but fall color happens in dogbane. It happens in Direvilla. It happens in all kinds of different things. So just know that there's lots of stuff to experience whenever we are throughout the season. And if you want to do it virtually, you also can do that. I've done a couple of plant-based videos, one in visiting Indian pipe bog, and the other one talking about late season things. So our goldenrods and our wetland plant diversity in the fall is really lovely. So check those out if you wanted to as well. So that's what I've got. I see that we've got questions. I'm so excited to take them and see what you've got. If you have more, please type them into the chat. I'm going to leave this screen and say thank you, everybody, for having me this evening. If you did have questions and you needed to leave early, no worries. Send me an email at naturalist@Sax-Zim. Happy to answer any questions you've got. Do check out our website. You can find a lot of our videos there. You can find the field trip schedule. I have posts about the bog bioblitzes, if bioblitzes are your thing. Lots of information on our website there too. So I'm going to leave this up and say thank you so much, everybody, for tuning in, for listening to my talk this evening. And I'm ready for questions, Eric. If you're ready for questions, yeah. I'm going to leave the screen up if that works for you.
Yep.
I can definitely move it if you need to.
Yeah, so I'll just start with some of the questions, then, feel free to read through the chat yourself if you want.
Excellent.
There was a question from Heather about, can you describe how you built the bog boardwalks?
Yeah, so super great question. And so again, trying to build anything in a wet spot gets really hard. And so we've done it in two different ways. The way that we do most of our boardwalks is by using something called bog feet. So these metal sort of trapezoids that are hollowed out on the bottom that just sort of sit on top of things. And so, if we didn't like where they were, if we wanted to leave, we could pull those out, and we're not really more than just settling on something. We're not digging a hole or anything like that. And so they're just setting on. They're adjustable with height, so we can kind of level them out, make them, to the height we want, and we could change it. Let's say we got a frost heave and we needed to shift a boardwalk section, we can unbolt it and we can just move it, which is really, really great. So that's how we do it. The other way that we've done it is by laying sort of railroad track style, laying down timbers and then just laying boardwalk planks across it. We've done that at one of our properties. It works all right, but we were hoping it would be a little more time saving and a little less expensive. Turns out it's not. So we're just going to keep doing the way that we've been doing it with those bog feet. And yeah, happy to answer more too in that regard. If you have further questions, send me an email. I can send you more pictures and stuff too. I didn't have any in the slideshow, but great question. Thanks so much.
Awesome. Grant had a question about sourcing plants. If you have any thoughts on a nursery where you might source carnivorous plants, like pitcher plants or sundews, where you go for that?
Yeah, great question. So oddly enough, people are really into carnivorous plants. So you can find a number of species of sundews. You can find butterworts. You can find, a number of different tropical pitchers, but you can also find some of our northern species as well. Oddly enough, Carolina Biological Supply has a number of different pitcher plants you can buy, especially if you like native stuff. They do have Sarracenia purpurea, which is our native vat pitcher. I don't know how well they would grow outside, but for terrarium use, for indoor use, absolutely. It's always tricky with sourcing those things. Where do they get them from and all of that? So I would say for indoor uses, absolutely. I don't know of anybody who keeps them around for outside use, but indoor use, yeah, Carolina Biological Supply does good. If you go on Etsy, there's a lot of people that have just done it in their homes and done little micro nurseries, if you will. I know a friend of ours here in Duluth, she got really into pitchers and sundews especially, and has been growing and propagating her own sundews for a long time now, a couple of years. So there are places you can find them. I'm not totally sure what exists fully, but I do know you can get some of the southern pitcher species. You can get purpurea and a couple of different drosseras too, so our sundews. So they're out there if you can find them. There are some places that do it, and they do it in a sort of ethical way too. So definitely consider that when you're looking for plants.
Awesome, thank you. There was a question from Dennis. Are these plants just found in the bog habitat? And Dennis, I'm not sure if you're referring to specific plants or just in general. So if you have anything you want to add, feel free to throw that in too.
Yeah, I will take that question from bog specialists outside of bog. That's how I might interpret that question just right now. But again, please feel free if you've got more information. Generally, they're only in those bogs. So if we think about, especially the big four that I talked about, Labrador tea, bog laurel, leatherleaf, and bog rosemary, you really don't get them outside of bogs. Some of them you'll get in fens too, but usually you only find them within those bogs. And along the roads you might get a few, but in a marsh you're not going to find them. In an upland forest you're definitely not going to find them. In a cutover area in some cases you're not going to find them because they don't have the conditions they want anymore. And so they are really truly specialized, especially if we get to the level of pitchers and sundews. Then you really have a hard time finding them outside of where they're supposed to be.
All right. So related to what you were just saying about clear cut, there was a question about the clear cut you mentioned in the ladies' tresses. Do you know anything about why that area was cut?
Great question. So it was an old school forest. It was the Cotton School forest. The Cotton School really doesn't exist anymore. There's no students that go to that school. They've sort of revamped it into another place. But school forests are very interesting because they are part of sort of our conservation legacy in Minnesota, but they're also a way for districts to get funding. If a district needs funding, it can utilize that resource as a way to get funds. They get funding from having them intact, but you can also get extra revenue from clearing those trees. And so that was the case. It was a real bummer. It was one of my favorite places in the whole bog. Really lovely old red pine, jack pine stand. So really amazing fungal diversity, some really awesome lichens in there, and the orchid diversity was really good. And so it's one of those places that it was early on in the organization. And so building connections with folks and trying to say, hey, maybe selectively log it and come in the winter with like horses and do a really like sort of old school method instead of just straight up clear cutting it. A lot of the folks who lived on that road too were really bummed that they'd cut it because they go to the hike or they go to ski or so yeah, it was really sad. I'm not sure, it would have been a district decision. So again, not necessarily something we could as an organization do much about other than say, hey, please reconsider. But yeah, if the school wasn't using it and they needed funding, that's the way it sort of goes in some cases. But yeah, thanks for that question.
All right. Eric was wondering, is it true that lady slippers can take up to 17 years to bloom?
Yeah, totally. And depending on the species, it can change too. So pinks take a very long time in some cases. Showies definitely do. They live for a long time too. Showies can live for 60 years or more. And so they do take a very long time to flower. When I was a naturalist up at Tetagooch State Park along the shore here, there was one pink lady slipper that I knew about before I knew how to find them. There was one that I knew about, and it grew at the camp host site. And the folks who were at the host site had been the campground hosts for a number of years, and 20 years or something like that. And they knew exactly when that plant started flowering because they were there the first year it flowered. And so it took maybe 10 or 11 years of them being there for it to flower. So it could have taken much longer than that. But yeah, they don't always bloom right away. And the other thing is that their bloom seasons can vary widely based on the environmental conditions. So if you think about the coral roots, they store a lot of energy in those corms. They have little ginger looking root corms. And we didn't even know we had early coral root the first 4 years that I worked for the Friends. We didn't know we had it. And then all of a sudden we just had hundreds of them. So obviously they had some conditions that they were storing energy for, and then boom, we're going to bloom and we're going to go. And so since then we can still find them, but definitely not to the same level as that first year. So yeah, they're really variable, especially those non-photosynthetic things like our coral roots. It's really environmentally determinate when they're going to bloom, and how long it takes them, I don't know for those species. It could take them even longer. I'm not quite sure, but yeah, terribly long bloom periods for some of those species before they get going, which, you know, that's the way plants go. Lead plants the same way, compass plants are the same way. So yeah, great question. Oop, you're muted, Eric.
Thank you. Yeah.
Yep.
Question related to visiting up there, places to camp up there. And then there was also a comment about not camping, but staying Alishes. I may have the pronunciation wrong. Feel free to correct me, but
yeah. Camping is a little bit harder, and I say a little bit harder because we are kind of in between things. And so we do list a number of things on our website. So if you head over to our website, we've got a tab that's called Plan Your Visit or Birding the Bog. I think it's under the Plan Your Visit tab. There's a number of recommendations for that. Hopefully, fingers crossed, we will have at least maybe a site available, maybe two available. One of our properties, our new properties, I'm going to have a snowshoe hike at this weekend, Starflower Bog, has a little parking pad, kind of camping pad on the south end of it. And so we've been kind of figuring out if we want to do that, if we want to make that available. We don't necessarily like folks to stay at the Welcome Center. The parking lot is there, it is available, but it just is a little tricky for us, you know, logistics wise, and like, you know, we don't necessarily want to have people in the parking lot all the time. But in the bog directly, the Zim recreation area, so McDavitt recreation area on the north end, they are definitely open to people camping there. If you go to the McDavitt Township's website, you can find information about who to contact. They just like to have a heads up, because if you want water, they can turn the water on for you. They're very happy to have folks camp up there. It's not rustic, or it's very rustic. You can't really build a fire, but there are outhouses there, so that's a bonus. And there are a couple of other places, but again, not very close to the bog. So Alishes is a great place to stay, right in the bog on the west side. I think there's also some availability at the Old School Lives. So the Cotton School does have some lodging availability as well, but you can find that on their website. So yeah, check out the website. I'm also happy to answer more questions too. I get it every year, so I'm pretty well seasoned in answering this question. So yeah, if you want more information, do send me an email or check out our website.
great. Have you had to do any restorations, and do you have issues with invasive plants?
Very good questions. So restoration work, not so much. Our hope is to keep those tracks that we find intact, which is great. One exception to that rule maybe is at Warren Nelson Bog. A few years ago now, there was a pretty major windstorm and a big blowdown. And so we had it salvage logged just to sort of clean it up a little bit, because it did look pretty bad and people were really worried about stuff. And so we cleaned it up, and then we went and replanted black spruce and we replanted tamarack just to give them a head start. And so that now is, you know, probably 5 or 6 years ago, maybe more. That's about it for restoration that we've been able to do, or we've needed to do, because we don't have a problem with invasives to the same degree as other places. Certainly there are things, you know, narrow-leaved cattail is a big problem. Reed canary, of course, is a problem. Tansy is a little bit of an issue, but up here, at least in the Duluth area or up in the bog, we also have our own kind of weird non-native species to worry about. Clustered or bristly bellflower is a little weirdo that just shows up in St. Louis County around the Duluth area, and inland a little ways. That is getting to be a little bit of a problem. Garden valerian is a really big problem in some places, but the benefit of being in an ecosystem that is very harsh, both because it gets very cold in the winter, sometimes can get pretty warm in the summer, but also has pretty poor nutrient conditions and pretty poor soils, we kind of limit what can grow, which is really nice. We don't have any issues with them inside our properties. Even if we have reed canary around the edge of a property, you know, in the ditch, it really doesn't get into the forest at all, which is nice. Certainly not the case for a lot of other species. Yeah, I think we're in okay shape. There are definitely people working on invasives in the area, because we do, if we're ahead of it, you know, if we're on the front end, it takes a lot less work to knock down 20 plants than it does 20 acres worth of plants. So something I keep an eye out for. I worked in invasive species stuff on prairies, so I know the work it takes, and it's a lot of work. So if we can halt that, we'd like to facilitate that with folks who are working in the area. So great questions.
Great. That's all I'm seeing for questions. Otherwise, a lot of thank yous, appreciation for your enthusiasm.
Thanks,
Some are
everybody.
saying they're going to have to visit outside of the winter now, so people really enjoyed it.
Yeah, totally. I mean, it is one of those things that we're grateful to have visitors for the winter, and grateful for folks who are just bird interested. But man, there's so much here. Do definitely plan on coming in the summer. There's a lot going on. Especially if you like staying moderately cool during the summer, you can stay in Duluth where it's 60 degrees all the time, and then go to the bog where it's a little warmer. So thanks so much, everybody. Again, if you have more questions, please do send me emails. I'm very happy to take them. And thank you so much for your words and for having me. I'll put one more push out. Are there any more questions? Is there a last round?
Go to the bathroom.
If not, okay, you've got my email.